The men in apartment 104. I used to live in a small, aging apartment complex in Oregon, built in the late 70s. You know the kind. Paper-thin walls, flickering hallway lights, and neighbors who mostly kept to themselves. I had moved in after a breakup, and although the place wasn't much, it was quiet at first. That changed when someone moved into apartment 104. The first time I noticed something off was about a week after he moved in. It was 3 a.m., and I was struggling with insomnia. From my window, I could see a bit of the apartment courtyard and the corridor that led to 104. That night, I saw the new guy standing completely still under the hallway light. No phone, no cigarette, just standing there for nearly 2 hours. I thought maybe he was drunk or high, but he didn't move an inch. Eventually, he just walked back inside. I figured it was none of my business, but it kept happening. Every few nights, he'd just stand there. Same time, same place, same motionless pose. One time, I swear he turned his head directly toward my window. I ducked, heart pounding. The hallway lights buzzed louder than usual that night. A few days later, I started hearing tapping. Very faint at first, like nails on a wall. It would go on for hours, then stop. Then came the scratching, slow, deliberate, like something clawing at the other side of my wall. One night I knocked back, annoyed. The scratching stopped immediately. Then a whisper, just one word, knock. I didn't sleep at all that night. I talked to the building manager, an older guy named Rick who had worked there for 20 years. When I mentioned apartment 104, he froze, then said, "That place has been empty for 6 months. No one's rented it since the last tenant disappeared." I laughed nervously. I had seen the man living there. Rick insisted on showing me. He unlocked the door to 104, and the apartment was empty. No furniture, dust on the floor. The air was cold, stagnant, and there was this faint, rotten smell, like mold and copper. But the creepiest part? On the wall facing my unit, scratched deeply into the paint, was the word knock. I moved out that weekend. Before I left, I stayed at a friend's place. On my final night, I returned to grab the last of my stuff. As I stepped into the apartment, I found an envelope wedged under my door. No name, no stamp, just a note inside with handwriting so erratic it barely looked human. "You shouldn't have knocked. I used to deliver pizza in a college town. The kind of place where you get weird requests, half-naked stoners, and the occasional prank. But one night something happened that genuinely shook me, and I still think about it. It was a slow Thursday night, and I was about to end my shift when a call came in. The address was on the edge of our delivery range, out past the last row of houses before the road turned to woods. I almost passed it up, but I needed the tip. When I got to the place, there were no lights on. It wasn't a house, more like a cabin, old and half buried by trees. I knocked, no answer. I called the number, no answer. Just as I was about to leave, the door creaked open. A guy stood in the shadows. He looked normal at first, but he had this vacant stare, like he wasn't fully there. He didn't say anything, just pointed behind him into the darkness. I told him the total. He didn't move. Then he whispered, "She wants you to bring it inside." Now we're told never to go inside, ever. But something about how he said it made my skin crawl. I took a step back and said I'd leave the pizza at the door. He didn't stop me. But as I turned, I heard what I swear was a second voice. Soft, female, coming from deeper inside the cabin. "Help! Please!" I froze. Every part of me wanted to get the hell out of there. But that voice, it sounded scared, desperate. So I called 911. I stayed by my car until the cops came, trying to explain what I heard. They went inside, I waited. About 20 minutes later, an officer came out and told me I'd done the right thing. There was a woman chained to a bed in the basement, barely conscious. Looked like she'd been there for days, maybe longer. The guy who answered the door, a drifter with a record a mile long, assault, stalking, abduction. The cabin wasn't even his. He'd been squatting there. I quit the job a week later. I never delivered pizza again. But I think about her sometimes. How long she'd been waiting, and how close I came to walking away. There's someone under the bed. I was 19 and had just moved out of my parents' house into a small studio apartment on the second floor of an older building in a quiet neighborhood. It wasn't much, but it was mine. No roommates, no curfew, just peace and independence. One night around 2:30 a.m., I was watching YouTube on my laptop, trying to tire myself out. I was lying in bed with all the lights off except for the glow from the screen. That's when I heard it, a soft dragging sound, like someone slowly pulling a hand across the wooden floor. At first, I thought it was my upstairs neighbor. The building was old and I could hear a lot through the walls. But this sound didn't come from above. It came from under my bed. My blood ran cold. I froze, every muscle in my body tightening, ears straining. I turned the volume on my laptop down and listened. Silence. Maybe I imagined it. Maybe I'm tired. I told myself that and forced a laugh, trying to shake the fear. Then I heard it again, slower this time, deliberate, closer to the edge of the bed. I didn't move. I didn't breathe. My phone was across the room charging. My apartment was tiny, maybe 400 square feet, but the few feet between me and my phone felt like miles. I gently slid off the bed, trying not to make a sound. I tiptoed to the kitchen where I kept a small paring knife in the drawer. As I gripped the handle, I dialed 911 on my phone. 911, what's your emergency? There's someone under my bed, I whispered. I heard them. Please send someone. The dispatcher stayed on the line, asking questions I barely heard. I was hyper-focused on the silence in the apartment. Then she said the police were 2 minutes away. Those 2 minutes felt like hours. Suddenly, I heard movement. Not under the bed, but from the front door. The handle turned. The deadbolt jiggled. Then I remembered, I never locked the deadbolt. I rushed to the door and threw the deadbolt just as someone on the other side pushed hard. They banged against the door once, twice, then silence. I pressed my eye to the peephole. What I saw made my stomach twist. There was a man, pale, gaunt, eyes wide and manic. He wasn't trying to break in anymore. He was smiling. Then he walked away. Police arrived minutes later and swept the apartment. What they found still haunts me. Under my bed was a knife, a sleeping bag, a bottle of water, and a set of photos. Photos of me taken from outside my window. The man had been living under my bed, watching me, waiting for something. They never found him. A Reddit user shared a terrifying experience about their old neighbor who seemed to have a dark obsession with them. It starts with the user moving into a new apartment and noticing that one of their neighbors, an older man, was always around. He'd offer help with things like bringing in groceries or carrying boxes, but he was always too insistent, too eager to get involved. At first, the user was polite but distant, not wanting to encourage too much interaction. But things started to take a strange turn when the neighbor started showing up at odd hours. He'd stand outside the apartment building, staring at the windows, especially the user's apartment. This became a regular occurrence. The user tried to ignore it, but it escalated when they started noticing that the neighbor knew far too much about their day-to-day life. Things they hadn't told him. He knew when they'd leave for work, when they came home, and even small details like the time the user always went to the grocery store. One evening, the user came home late after a shift at work and went to bed. They woke up in the middle of the night to the sound of something moving in their apartment. They froze. It wasn't just any noise. It was the sound of something heavy scraping across the floor. Terrified, the user stayed still, trying to make sense of what was happening. The noises stopped, and after a long while, they built up the courage to get out of bed. To their shock, they found the neighbor's shoes by the door. The door had been unlocked, but there were no signs of forced entry. When they checked around the apartment, everything appeared to be in place. The feeling of being watched didn't go away, but the worst was yet to come. The next day, the user decided to confront the neighbor. They knocked on his door and told him that they didn't appreciate his constant hovering around their life. The neighbor appeared normal, even friendly, but when the user left, they noticed something strange. The blinds in their apartment were slightly parted, and they could see the neighbor's silhouette standing by his window, staring directly at them. The final straw came one day when the user found an envelope outside their door. It contained a handwritten note that said, "I know you're upset. I just wanted to protect you." It was signed with the neighbor's name. The user reported everything to the landlord and, later, to the police. It turned out that the neighbor had a history of stalking and had been doing the same thing to previous tenants. He was arrested and moved out shortly afterward, but the lingering feeling of violation stayed with the user. The stalker who came into my house, a Reddit user who went by the username u/frostedkarma, shared a terrifying account of being stalked for months. It all started when they began noticing strange things happening around their apartment. At first, it was small things like lights being left on when they were sure they turned them off, or the sound of footsteps when no one was around. But it escalated quickly. One night, they came home to find their front door slightly ajar. They always locked it, and there was no reason it should have been open. This is when the creepy feeling truly started to settle in. The user chalked it up to a mistake and quickly checked the apartment to make sure nothing was stolen. Everything seemed fine, but they couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't alone. A few weeks later, they started finding personal items out of place. Keys on the counter when they were sure they left them on the table, or their phone charger moved from the living room to the kitchen. They also noticed small pieces of paper with scribbled notes left at their doorstep. The notes were all unsettling, vague, cryptic messages, as if the writer was watching them and trying to send a warning. Then the real nightmare began. One evening after work, the user came home late to find a message on their answering machine. The voice was distorted, but it clearly said, "I've been waiting for you." They immediately called the police, but when they arrived, there was no evidence of forced entry. They couldn't prove anyone had been in the apartment. Things got worse. The Redditor began receiving phone calls late at night, just breathing, heavy and rhythmic. They had to change their number, but the calls didn't stop. Then it escalated further when the user came home one day to find a large, menacing figure standing in their hallway. It was a man, someone they didn't know, standing still and silent, almost like he was waiting for them. The user froze, terrified, but the man didn't move, just stared at them. In a panic, they ran for the door, but the man started following them, saying, "I'm right behind you. You can't escape me." After a struggle and a narrow escape, they managed to lock themselves out of the house and ran to a neighbor's place. The police came again, but the man was never found. The user never returned to that apartment. The entire ordeal left them with deep anxiety and paranoia, always looking over their shoulder, wondering if that man would ever return. The creepy incident that happened while I was house sitting. I used to house sit for a family friend in a very quiet, rural area. The house was old but well kept. I always thought it was a little eerie because the place was huge, isolated, and surrounded by thick woods. But I had no problem staying there. The family had 3 kids who were usually away at camp, so it was just me alone in the house for weeks at a time. One summer, I was asked to house sit again for a weekend. I agreed, thinking it would be a normal, uneventful stay. That's when the strange things started happening. The first night was fine. I spent the evening watching movies and reading until I started hearing what sounded like footsteps upstairs. The house had wooden floors and it creaked a lot, so I assumed it was just the house settling, or maybe even a rodent. I checked the upstairs anyway, but the place seemed empty, so I went to bed. The next night, the footsteps started again. They were heavier this time, like someone walking slowly, dragging their feet. I got up, went upstairs, but again, there was no one there. It felt like I was being watched. I brushed it off as my imagination playing tricks on me, but the feeling of unease stuck with me. The third night, things got worse. I was lying in bed when I heard someone whispering my name. At first, I thought it was just the wind, or maybe I was just overly tired. But then I heard it again, clearer this time. A soft, slow whisper. "Come upstairs." Now I was terrified. I grabbed my phone and texted my friend to ask if anyone else was home. She replied almost immediately saying no. She was out of town, and there was no one else staying in the house. I couldn't just ignore what was happening anymore. I grabbed a flashlight and slowly made my way upstairs, all the while hearing that faint whispering. When I reached the top of the stairs, I saw something that still haunts me to this day. There was a shadow at the far end of the hallway, just standing there. It wasn't a person, but a shape that didn't belong. It was tall, pitch black, and had no discernible features. The shape seemed to move slightly, like it was breathing or shifting. I froze. I didn't know what to do. My heart was racing. My mind was screaming at me to run. But I stood there frozen with fear, unable to move or speak. After what felt like hours, though it was probably only a few minutes, the shadow seemed to dissipate, melting into the darkness. I turned around and ran back downstairs, locked all the doors, and called my friend, asking if she could come home early. I didn't feel safe there anymore. The strange thing. The next day, going through the house to leave, I found a note. It was written in what looked like child's handwriting and said, "We know you're here. You'll never leave." I'm not sure if it was one of the kids messing around, but the feeling of being watched, of something sinister being in that house, stayed with me for weeks after. I haven't house sat for anyone since then, and honestly, I don't think I'll ever go back to that house. The mysterious disappearance of the Beaumont children. This story is deeply unsettling as it revolves around the disappearance of 3 young siblings in broad daylight and the mystery that has haunted Australia for decades. It happened on the 26th of January 1966 when the Beaumont children, Jane, 9, Arna, 7, and Grant, 4, decided to go to Glenelg Beach, a popular spot in Adelaide. Their mother had allowed them to go to the beach alone, as it was only a short walk from their home, and she was a bit too trusting, believing her children would be fine. The kids were well known at the beach, and no one thought twice about them walking there by themselves. When they arrived at the beach, they were seen by witnesses. They played near the water and had ice creams before vanishing without a trace. A few hours later, they hadn't returned home, and their worried mother sent the police to search for them. Strangely, there was no sign of struggle, and no one had seen them leave the beach. Despite widespread media coverage, police investigations, and multiple leads over the years, the children were never found. There were reports of a man seen speaking with the children, and some even speculated he was seen coaxing them into a car. The case became one of the most famous child disappearances in Australian history, and it remains unsolved. Over the years, there have been bizarre developments. A man named the Child Killer was implicated in many crimes, and theories about a serial killer in the area have surfaced. But even after extensive searches, some involving divers in the sea, no trace of the children has been found. The strange thing is, the case is still actively investigated, but the more the authorities dig, the deeper the mystery becomes. Many people believe the children were taken by someone close to them, or that they were victims of a serial killer who targeted children. But the fear and uncertainty surrounding their disappearance remains. What happened to the Beaumont children is still one of Australia's most chilling unsolved mysteries. This case leaves a sense of unease, imagining children disappearing so suddenly, and the mystery of what happened to them continues to haunt families and detectives even today. The feeling of helplessness and loss in this story is what makes it so disturbing. The Watcher House, a disturbing true story. A family in Westfield, New Jersey, purchased a beautiful house in 2014, thinking it would be the start of their dream life. The house on 657 Boulevard was a charming, large colonial with a beautiful lawn and lovely neighborhood. It was their perfect forever home, and they had big plans for it. However, their dreams quickly turned into a nightmare. Soon after they moved in, the family began receiving strange, cryptic letters from someone who identified themselves as the Watcher. The letters were postmarked from nearby towns, and they appeared to be written by someone obsessed with the house, almost as if they had been watching it for years. The first letter read, "Dearest new neighbor at 657 Boulevard, allow me to welcome you to the neighborhood. How did you end up here? Did 657 Boulevard call to you with its force? The house has been the subject of my family for decades now, and as it approaches its 110th birthday, I have been put in charge of watching and waiting for its second coming. My grandfather watched the house in the 1920s, and my father watched it in the 1960s. It is now my time. The watcher continued. I am the watcher and have been in control of 657 Boulevard for as long as I can remember. I will be watching you. The letter continued to mention the family's children by name and describe specific details about them, details they hadn't shared with anyone. The letters also referenced their move-in process, saying things like, I see you are putting in the pool. The girl's room looks lovely. The watcher seemed to know everything about their personal life, their plans for the house, and the renovations they were making. Terrified, the family contacted the police, but after some investigation, they discovered that there was no solid evidence to identify the letter writer. It was impossible to trace the person, as there were no fingerprints, and the postmarks on the letters were from nearby towns. The family received more letters over the next few weeks, each more unsettling than the last. The watcher mentioned the children's names again, referencing their movements in detail, which made it clear that the family was being surveilled. In one letter, the watcher warned them about their renovations, saying, "Stop changing things. I am in charge of the house now." The family became afraid to even go outside. They hired private investigators, but no one could uncover the identity of the watcher. As the letters grew increasingly disturbing, the family decided they had no choice but to move out. They couldn't live in a house knowing someone was constantly watching them. Eventually, the family decided to put the house up for sale, but before they could sell it, they received one final letter from the watcher. It was more cryptic and menacing than the others, suggesting that the watcher was still keeping an eye on the property. The case became even more disturbing when it was revealed that the previous owners, who had lived in the house for decades, claimed they had never received any letters and were unaware of any watcher. The new owners, though, were the only ones targeted. After all efforts to find out who the watcher was failed, the mystery remains unsolved, and the house is still tied to the eerie and unsettling legend. The family, now scarred by the experience, was left to wonder, who was the watcher? Was it an obsessed neighbor? Or something darker, perhaps even a remnant of something ancient that had always been tied to the house? The letters and the strange obsession with their family suggest that it was someone or something beyond ordinary human understanding. This chilling real-life mystery left everyone involved deeply unsettled, and despite the media attention and police investigations, it remains unsolved. If you want to read more about this story, there are numerous threads on Reddit where people have tried to piece together the mystery, though no answers have surfaced to this day. The creepy man in the park. A Reddit user shared a chilling experience from their childhood. They lived in a small suburban town and would often visit a nearby park with their best friend. The park had a small wooded area, but it was mostly a place for kids to play. One day, when the user was around 12 years old, they were with their friend, just walking around the park like they usually did. They noticed a man sitting on one of the benches near the playground. He was oddly dressed in a long trench coat, despite the warm weather. He was looking at them in a way that made them uncomfortable, and they couldn't shake the feeling that he was watching them too intently. At first, they tried to ignore him, thinking he was just another odd adult. But as they wandered further into the park, they kept seeing him, always watching them, always at a distance. As the sun started to set, the user and their friend decided to leave. But just as they were about to head toward the exit, the man stood up from the bench and started following them. They quickly turned around and walked faster, thinking it was just a coincidence. But then the man started to run. The user and their friend began to panic and sprinted toward the exit, not looking back. When they reached the gates, they saw the man standing at the edge of the park, just staring at them, almost motionless. He didn't move at all as they climbed into their bike and rode off, hearts pounding. They didn't go back to that park for weeks after that. Years later, the user learned through a local news story that a man matching the description of the creepy guy had been found in the park around the time they had the experience. He had been arrested for stalking multiple children in the area. It's one of those stories that makes your skin crawl, knowing that sometimes we don't realize when danger's lurking right under our noses. The silent intruder. A Reddit user shared a terrifying experience that happened to them a few years ago, and it still haunts them. The user, who we'll refer to as C, lived in a quiet neighborhood where nothing unusual ever happened. One night, C woke up at 2 a.m. to a strange, almost imperceptible noise. It wasn't enough to wake them up fully, but just enough to make them feel uneasy. The sound was coming from somewhere in the house, faint footsteps, but they weren't loud enough to make it clear if they were coming from inside the house or outside. C decided to get up to investigate and walk through their dark hallway. The entire house was still, except for the occasional creak of the floorboards. When they passed the kitchen, C noticed that the door to the garage was ajar. Thinking nothing of it, they closed it. However, as they turned around to go back to bed, they felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as though someone was watching them. C froze in place and listened. What they heard next was the distinct sound of someone breathing heavily, right behind them. C turned around, but no one was there. Frozen in fear, they turned back around, only to see something far worse. The garage door was open again. As they slowly approached it, C realized something even more horrifying. A second set of footprints, not theirs, was now clearly visible in the dust on the garage floor. Terrified, they ran back to their bedroom, locked the door, and called the police. When the police arrived, they found no one in the house, but they discovered something chilling. A small window in the kitchen that had been left open, allowing someone to sneak in and out of the house undetected. Later, the police confirmed that there had been reports of a similar break-in spree in the neighborhood, but no one ever saw or caught the intruder. To this day, C still hears noises in the middle of the night, but they can't tell whether it's their imagination or the feeling that someone is still watching them. The story leaves readers shaken, as it taps into the fear of being watched and the feeling of vulnerability in your own home. It remains one of the most terrifying true stories shared on Reddit. The disappearance of a young woman in a remote town. In 2014, a Reddit user shared a terrifying account of the mysterious disappearance of his sister, who had gone missing in a small, isolated town. The story, posted to the r/unresolved mysteries subreddit, has haunted people ever since. It all started when the user's sister, a 22-year-old named Rachel, decided to take a trip to a quiet, rural town for a break from the city. She was an avid traveler and often ventured off on her own, but this time, something felt off. Rachel called her family a few days into her stay, telling them she was exploring the area, but she seemed a bit distracted and uneasy during the call. Her last words were, "I think I saw something weird, but it's probably nothing. I'll talk to you tomorrow." The next morning she was gone. The Reddit user described how he went to the town to search for her, but when he arrived, the local police were uninterested in helping. They shrugged off his questions, citing the small-town vibe and telling him that his sister was probably just off having fun, and they'd find her soon. But as days turned into weeks, no one could find any trace of Rachel. No one had seen her leave, and there was no evidence of any crime. The locals acted oddly tight-lipped, refusing to speak about her. The Reddit user started investigating on his own, and what he discovered was chilling. Several people in the town, some of whom had worked at the same hotel Rachel had stayed in, were later revealed to have criminal backgrounds, some with ties to unreported disappearances from the town's past. Months later, after nearly giving up hope, the Reddit user returned to the town, desperate for answers. When he spoke to a local elder who had been living there for decades, the man revealed a disturbing fact. The town was known for its missing person cases, many of which never made the news. He hinted that there was something about the area that drew people in, something that wasn't entirely natural. Rachel's case remains unsolved, and her brother continues to search for answers, convinced that whatever happened to her is linked to something much darker in the town. What made this story even more eerie were the details that kept emerging on Reddit. A user commented that there had been rumors about a strange, abandoned house on the outskirts of town, and some locals believed it was a place where people went to disappear. Another commenter mentioned that the town had been connected to a cult-like group in the past, though this was never confirmed. To this day, Rachel's disappearance remains a mystery, and the Reddit thread has left many wondering whether she stumbled upon something far more sinister than anyone could have imagined. This story is a great example of how some Reddit posts give insight into true unnerving experiences that blur the lines between the known and the unknown. The Man in the Mirror True Scary Story. This happened a few years ago. I was a college student living off campus with a few friends in a nice older house. The house was a bit run down, but nothing out of the ordinary, and we loved it. One night, after finishing some homework and watching a movie, I went to bed around midnight. I woke up suddenly in the middle of the night. My room was pitch black, except for the faint light from the hallway. I had this odd feeling like something wasn't right. It was that primal instinct you get when something's wrong, but you can't quite put your finger on it. I tried to shake it off, but I couldn't get back to sleep. I looked at the clock on my nightstand and then noticed something strange. A shape in the reflection of my window. The reflection didn't make sense. The window was facing a brick wall, so why was there a dark figure standing there? I froze. It wasn't just a shadow, but a person standing in the window frame, facing the wall. My heart started kept pounding, and my brain tried to reason it away, but I couldn't. I slowly crept out of bed and quietly walked toward the window, hoping it was just a trick of the light. But the closer I got, the more real the figure seemed. It was a man, his face barely visible, just enough to make out a dark, smooth outline. I reached the window and peered outside. Nothing. The figure was gone. At this point, I was terrified. I checked the front door to make sure it was locked. Then I heard something that made my stomach drop. Footsteps in the hall. I rushed to the door of my room, but when I looked through the crack, there was no one there. I decided to leave my room and check the house, but as I opened my bedroom door, I saw something chilling. There was a figure standing in the hallway, directly in front of my door, blocking the way. I couldn't see his face, but I could hear the soft sound of breathing, slow and deliberate. I ran back into my room and slammed the door, locking it. I didn't know what to do. I could hear the footsteps now, pacing back and forth outside my door. I had no idea if it was someone who lived in the house, but no one else was supposed to be awake. My friends were all in their rooms, asleep. I picked up my phone and dialed 911, my hands shaking uncontrollably. But just as the call was ringing, the footsteps stopped. I didn't hear anything for a long time. The silence was deafening. Then, as I was about to speak to the dispatcher, I heard a sound that made my blood run cold. A faint knock on my bedroom door. I didn't answer. The knock repeated louder this time, followed by a voice barely audible, whispering through the door, "Let me in." It wasn't a familiar voice. I held my breath and stayed absolutely still, praying he wouldn't hear me breathing. The knocking continued for several minutes, then abruptly stopped. I couldn't hear anything outside my door, but I wasn't sure if I should check. Eventually, I gathered the courage to open the door, but there was nothing there. The hall was empty. I stayed up the rest of the night, unable to shake the feeling that I wasn't alone. In the morning, I checked the locks on all the doors and windows, but nothing was disturbed. My friends didn't hear anything. I asked them if anyone had come by or tried to get in during the night, but they all said no. It wasn't until a few weeks later when I found out that there had been an attempted break-in at a nearby house. The police caught the guy, and when I saw his picture on the news, my blood ran cold. It was the man I saw in the reflection in my window. To this day, I don't know how he got into the house, but I'll never forget that night. I don't sleep well anymore, especially when there's a reflection of a dark figure in my window. This story touches on the fear of being watched or stalked, combined with a supernatural element of seeing something that shouldn't be there. The tension builds with each step the narrator takes, making it feel like a psychological horror story that leaves you questioning reality and your own safety. The idea of an intruder being so close but not making his presence known until it's almost too late is terrifying. The final twist, finding out the man was a real criminal, makes the situation even more real and disturbing. The story of the stalker who was always watching it was about 2 years ago when I moved to a new city. I was living alone in a small apartment. Everything seemed fine at first, nothing unusual. However, things quickly took a strange turn. It started with someone knocking on my door at odd hours. At first, I thought it was a mistake or some neighbor needing something. But the knocks were becoming more frequent, and sometimes I'd hear the sound of heavy breathing through the door. When I opened it, no one was there. I thought it was my imagination playing tricks on me. One evening, I was sitting in my living room watching TV when I noticed something odd. The blinds on my window were slightly open. I never left them open, but they were open enough for me to see out onto the street. A figure was standing at the edge of the sidewalk watching my apartment. I couldn't make out much, but I knew it wasn't someone I recognized. I quickly closed the blinds and locked the windows. I figured it could just be someone walking by, or maybe even a prank. I didn't think much more of it. But then the letter started. The first one was just a cryptic note, written in what appeared to be rushed handwriting. I see you. The next day, another note appeared in my mailbox. It was much more specific. The letter detailed the exact time I had gotten home the previous evening, the time I went out to the grocery store, and even the food I had bought. The handwriting was shakier this time, and the words made my blood run cold. It didn't stop there. Each letter became more detailed, more unsettling. The person began describing things about my apartment, the way I decorated, the exact route I took when walking out of the building. They started sending pictures too. Photos of me walking down the street, taken from a distance. There were no faces in the pictures, just shadows. One night I returned home late from work. As I opened the door to my apartment, I found something new. A single black balloon was tied to the doorknob. There was no note attached, but it was clear this was a message of some kind. I was terrified at this point, but I didn't know who to turn to. I filed a report with the police, but they were skeptical. It's just a prank, they said. But as the days went on, I began to feel like I was being followed. I'd glance over my shoulder when walking, and sometimes I'd swear I saw someone in the corner of my eye, just out of reach. It escalated to the point where I couldn't go anywhere without feeling like I was being watched. I took different routes to work, tried to shake off any tail, but it never worked. I'd arrive home and find a new message waiting for me on my door or under my car windshield. Finally, one night, I was coming home from the store, walking up the stairs to my apartment. I felt the familiar dread creeping up my spine. As I reached my door, I froze. I saw a figure standing at the end of the hallway. He was tall, wearing a hoodie, and I couldn't see his face, but there was no mistaking the way he was standing. He was waiting for me. I bolted into my apartment, locked the door, and immediately called the police. When they arrived, the figure was gone, but they didn't find anything to confirm he had been there. No footprints, no fingerprints, no sign that he had even been in the building. After that, I moved out of that apartment. I changed my number, my email, and I even started taking self-defense classes. But the worst part? The person who had been stalking me, he was never caught. I still receive strange letters sometimes, always postmarked from random places, always cryptic, always signed with the same message. I see you. This story is terrifying because of its realism. It's a true account of someone who went through an unexplainable and sinister experience with a stalker who seemed to always be one step ahead. The unsettling feeling of being watched, combined with the mystery of the stalker's identity, adds to the horror. What makes it worse is that the situation was never fully resolved. This person is still out there, lurking, watching, and sending messages. The story is a reminder that sometimes real life can be far more frightening than fiction. The Staircase in the Dark, a Reddit user, u/bananaply, shared a story on the Let's Not Meet subreddit that has haunted many readers. The story is about a terrifying encounter with a staircase that seemed to lead nowhere, and perhaps even somewhere sinister. It started with a Redditor who had just moved into a new home in a quiet, rural area. The house was older, but it had charm. There was one thing that caught the Redditor's attention right away: a staircase that led down into what seemed like a basement. The thing was, no one ever used it. The door at the bottom was locked, and the stairs themselves were oddly narrow, hidden behind an old wooden door that looked as if it hadn't been opened in decades. One night, after some restless sleep, the Redditor decided to explore. They crept downstairs, drawn by an irresistible curiosity. When they opened the door to the basement, they were struck by a sense of foreboding. The staircase was steep and narrow, descending into complete darkness. There were no lights down there. Feeling brave, or perhaps just foolish, the Redditor grabbed a flashlight and began to climb down. The deeper they went, the colder it became, and the air felt heavy, like something was watching them. At the very bottom of the stairs, they discovered a small wooden door, identical to the one they had entered through. They opened it, expecting to find something that explained the strange atmosphere in the house. But when they swung the door open, it revealed nothing but a solid wall of dark earth. No passageway, no other room. Just an empty, solid barrier. The Redditor was about to leave when they heard something. A soft noise like a footstep coming from above them. Heart racing, they froze, assuming someone was playing a prank. But when they looked up, they saw the shadow of someone standing at the top of the stairs, a figure silhouetted by the dim light from above, watching them in silence. Panic surged. The Redditor rushed up the stairs and slammed the door behind them, locking it with trembling hands. When they turned to face the room, there was no one there. No footprints, no sounds. The Redditor never went back down that staircase again. This disturbing story combines the eerie feeling of being watched with the unsettling idea of something or someone possibly lingering just out of sight. The Redditor's chilling encounter has sparked many discussions about the unknown, unseen forces that might inhabit old, seemingly innocent places. The fear of the unknown, combined with the isolation and strange happenings, creates a terrifying narrative. The Babysitter and the Man Upstairs. This story was shared on Reddit by a user who recounts a disturbing event from their past. It takes place during a night where everything seemed normal at first, but quickly took a terrifying turn. A teenage girl named Sarah had been babysitting for a family in her town. It was a typical evening. The parents were out for the night, and Sarah was left in charge of the children. After putting the kids to bed, she was casually watching TV in the living room, trying to keep herself entertained as the hours passed by. Around midnight, the phone rang. Sarah picked it up, but there was just silence on the other end. Thinking it was a prank, she hung up. Not long after, the phone rang again, and this time she could hear breathing. Panicked, Sarah hung up once more. She was now visibly shaken, but the night continued without incident, or so she thought. Not long after, the phone rang again, but this time, the voice in the other end was different. It was a gruff man's voice asking, "Have you checked the children?" The question echoed in Sarah's mind, sending a shiver down her spine. She assumed it was a prank call, but the timing was off. It felt too sinister. She tried calling the parents, but they weren't answering. Her unease grew as she started hearing strange noises from upstairs, coming from the children's room. They were asleep, but Sarah's instincts told her something was wrong. She decided to check on them. As she tiptoed up the stairs, she saw something that would haunt her for the rest of her life. Standing in the hallway, just outside the children's room, was a man. He was dressed in dark clothes and seemed to be watching her. The moment she saw him, he turned and ran toward the window. In a panic, Sarah ran back downstairs, grabbed the kids, and ran to a neighbor's house to call the police. The police arrived quickly, but they found no sign of the intruder. They did, however, make an unsettling discovery. The phone lines had been cut. It turns out the man had been inside the house the entire time, watching Sarah through the house's internal phone system and waiting for the right moment to make himself known. As the investigation continued, they learned that Sarah wasn't the first babysitter the men had targeted. The same phone call had been made to other sitters in the area. It turns out that the man had been posing as a normal neighbor for months before stalking and terrorizing young girls like Sarah. The scariest part? The phone call where he asked, "Have you checked the children?" wasn't just a random question. It was a warning. He had already been inside the house, lurking in the shadows, silently watching. This story is terrifying because it highlights how easily someone can invade your space and go unnoticed, especially when you're alone in someone else's house. The idea of being watched and not knowing it is one of the most disturbing thoughts. It's one of those unsettling reminders